Go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to everyone in the room and to some crowd on Zoom. I'm Bruce Grant from anthropology here at NYU, lately of the College of Liberal Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest today to the Jordan Center, Marianne Kamp. When I first came to NYU 20 years ago, I thought this would be such a great, after teaching in the American suburbs for a while, I thought coming to the big city would mean everything for the study of Central Asia and the Caucasus, and I'd be in constant conversation with people, only to learn that all the conversation was still going on at Indiana University, and only a few other places and bits and pieces. So it's really Marianne, who's come from the Vatican, to share a bit with us, short of being from Central Asia proper, right? So Marianne's a professor of Central Eurasian Studies. She did her undergraduate degree at Dartmouth, her PhD at the undergraduate degree, if I have it right, in Russian literature at Dartmouth, then an MA PhD at the University of Chicago in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. An early adopter of transnational translinguistic consciousness for understanding the Soviet period, way ahead of many of us. And so I have been keen to follow her ever since she started. She's the author of two very important books for our field. I want to make sure I get the titles right. The first, of course, known only because it's been out longer, The New Woman in Uzbekistan, Islam, Modernity, Unveiling After Communism, which came out some years back and really...
Like a long time ago.
Those of you who still feel young and promising, this is not a helpful position. And while the name might certainly just suggest, an abiding scholar of the Soviet period, a social historian, I'm tempted to say an honorary anthropologist, but that would only make me look parochial and not serve the kinds of fields of oral history and beyond that Marianne's been really important and pioneering in former Soviet space. And so, while many of us have been engaged in her work, it's not in any way enough to simply just say, oh, right. The second you say gender in Central Asia, people think of Gregory Marcel, they think of the veil, they think of, all the categories in which we might interpolate that. But from the very beginning, she's become an extremely substantial thinker around questions of how the Soviet project was understood by varied and competing groups across, of course, this vast Soviet space. She followed with another book, a second monograph, which came out just last year, of course, which is going to be the subject of today's visit. The full title, Collectivization Generation, Oral Histories of a Social Revolution, again in Uzbekistan. But I don't want to miss the chance to just give an example of how generous she's been as a colleague by working with a collaborator to release an English translation and interpretation of a book about Muslim women in the Fergana Valley, which first came out in Kazan in the late 19th century. There's a really sustained corpus of work around this, of which I think we're going to get the yield today. I want to give a shout out to someone who, at least from my view, is on the screen, to those of us here at 19 University Place. Morgan Liu is going to be joining us as a discussant. He'll be known to some of us in the room who are scholars of Central Asia as the author of the wonderful book Under Solomon's Throne. Morgan got his PhD at Michigan, trained as a cultural anthropologist, widely regarded as one of the best interpreters of Central Asian history, the Soviet period, Islamic social justice, urban spaces. Those are just some of the things. And of course, having done his primary work in Osh, among other places, looking at kind of transnational communities in Central Asian worlds. Currently chairing the Department of Near Eastern Languages, and I want to get this right again, sorry, Morgan, Department of Near Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at Ohio State University, leading that group. So our session for today, as always, we'll give the chair over to Marianne. Morgan will make some comments and then we'll open it up to everyone.
Thank you so much. What a generous introduction, and it's fun for me to be able to have Morgan commenting on this. We've known each other for really quite a very long time. So, when I give a book talk, I'm always thinking about, okay, who's the audience? Are you people who actually have read part of this book, or am I presenting it to people who have not read any of it? And I kind of go for the, I'm not assuming you've read any of it. And if you have, fantastic, that's lovely, we'll have more to talk about. But that forces me to give you a bit of a thumbnail and kind of what is this book about and what are some of the key points, and then not the whole book, okay, because that would be crazy. So a little bit about this project. When I began it, my goal was really to learn what I could about collectivization in Uzbekistan from still living people who could tell me about it. And it's a good thing that I'm a really, really slow writer. This project was actually the research, the on-the-ground research took place in the early 2000s. So I am like the world's slowest writer, and that's why the book came out last year. Before starting this project, I was familiar with the literature on collectivization in the Soviet Union and archivally based studies from Central Asia and so forth. So I thought I knew something going in. Thought I did. Colleagues that who I was able to work with, so Russell Zanka and Elior Karimov and I put together this oral history interviewing project and worked with young scholars from Uzbekistan. Ultimately, we carried out 120 oral history interviews in 7 different provinces of Uzbekistan. And our respondents were in their 70s to past 100. They were kind of phenomenal. So we were quite, just to answer, how was that possible? In every district in Uzbekistan, every village even, there was someone who worked for the local administration who was the representative for pensioners and veterans. And when the district received a letter from our organization and said, would you allow us to do some interviewing there, they tasked that representative with finding us respondents who would be willing to talk to us. And fortunately, that meant they chose people of sound mind. So, of course, there are many, many old people, and not every one of them is capable of telling a lot about their past. And so we had this little group of intermediaries who possibly, were selecting their friends, but they were selecting their friends who actually could, they knew, could remember the past and were willing to talk about it. So why do this? Basically, I was trained by Sheila Fitzpatrick, and so I'm a social historian interested in how things really worked in the Soviet Union, but I also have this very history from below kind of approach. I want to know ordinary people's experiences as opposed to what the party archive can tell me. So ultimately, this winds up then with a book where I am, to some extent, comparing what I can learn from the stories people tell and the things that are collected, published, etc., in the documented record. Just a little quote from the book. What is one takeaway? The interviews from Uzbekistan show that although there was resistance to collectivization, there were also many who believed that collectivization would improve their lives. And the believers either passively or actively supported this radical transformation, securing from below the policies that were imposed from above. And they were willing to talk about this even after the Soviet Union was over, and nobody was forcing them to say anything like that. They still would say things like that. So the collection of oral histories really ran the gamut from people who had been completely dispossessed and turned into kulaks to those who had felt that they were the beneficiaries of this program. And so it forced me to be really intentional in my own analysis, to think about whose voices am I hearing? What is their positionality? What was it then? How does it transform? how does that shape their memory and their story? This is a map of the Uzbek SSR in 1928, and in the book it's in black and white, and that's why I show it to you here in color, because it's much nicer. This is from the 1928 Atlas of the Soviet Union. Uzbekistan doesn't look like it used to. So we conducted our interviews in those places where there are stars. But I also make a delineation in the book that's a historical fact. Area A was part of Russian Turkestan. It had been under Russian administration since the 1860s or 1870s, and that had brought about a lot of transformation, particularly in pushing people in that area to embrace a cash-based cotton cropping kind of economy. Area B was the Bukharan Emirate, which was a protectorate of the Russian Empire, but not under direct rule. Its economy was quite different, and there wasn't the heavy emphasis on cotton monoculture or anything like that. Area C was the Khiva Khanate, another protectorate. Notice here it's an exclave of Uzbekistan at that time, and also notice Area D, Tajikistan was part of Uzbekistan at that time. So this is a different looking Uzbekistan. In my analysis, I'm pretty careful to talk about places that remain Uzbekistan. So this is not about Tajikistan at all, although quite a lot of the things that could be said there would be similar. I give a little timeline here of collectivization, and for those of us who are historians, we always need to know where we stand in time. Okay, what happened then? What happened then? And for anybody who's not, this is darn boring. So I'll just run through a couple of key points. From 1925 to 1928 in Uzbekistan, there was land reform. There had not been land reform before. When we read a history of the Soviet Union, we can see that there is land reform starting from 1918, frankly, that's basically from the ground seizures from landowners and so forth. None of that happened in Uzbekistan until after the end of what is called the Basmachi War. There was a certain amount of peace, and then it was possible to implement some new programs. I'll talk a little bit about what that meant in Uzbekistan. In 1929, Stalin announced mass collectivization and also the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, meaning now we're not just going after the rich people to take their property, we're going to try to destroy their lives entirely, pretty much. And at first, collectivization was supposed to be about grain regions. So the first areas that were announced as this is an area of total collectivization, those were grain-intensive regions all over the Soviet Union. And then a couple of weeks later, they said, oh, and cotton too. Like, cotton, well, there you go. And so collectivization was implemented in Uzbekistan very quickly in this totally helter-skelter kind of way, starting in January 1930. And by 1935, almost all farmed land and all farming families belonged to either a collective farm or a state farm. So the whole process moved along pretty fast. Okay, so today's outline, I'm going to give you some faces and some stories, because why do oral history if I'm not going to give you faces and stories, right? So first of all, a little bit on who joined and why, and then a little bit on who got arrested. So we'll talk about kulaks. And then I'll give you a dichotomous choice. So I'm going to do two parts, and then I'll give you a choice. We can either talk about tractors or we can talk about orphans. Okay, so there will be a vote later on, and that's my test to see if you're still awake. Okay, I'll introduce you to one of our respondents, but in order to explain this, the question of this particular chapter is, what kinds of people said that their families willingly and happily joined a kolkhoz early on? Somebody comes around and agitates and they're like, yeah, I'm all in. Who did that? Why? We might need to know, first of all, that in Uzbekistan, their land was privately owned. So if you were a large landowner, you might have 100 hectares. If you were an ordinary farmer, you might have 5 hectares to 10, somewhere in there. And if you were one of the people who got classified as the poor, you might own 1 hectare, you might own nothing at all. You might be a merdikar, that is a person who made their living fundamentally as a day laborer, or a seasonal laborer, or you might be a sharecropper. There were a lot of people who made their living by sharecropping. So organizers or agitators then went around and gave their speeches, and this is Halil. He was actually born in 1905, so he was one of our oldest speakers. He had worked as a merdikar, that is, as that seasonal worker, in the gates of the rich, and that's a set phrase in Uzbek that a lot of people used. I worked in the gates of the rich. He recalled joining a kolkhoz as soon as he was called to a meeting where taxation was part of the discussion, as he recalled it. He said, a man named Islamov, and this was a fascinating thing, people actually remembered the names of the people who came to their communities, the names of people who were the first tractor drivers, the names of the people they dispossessed. These were stories that they had told over and over, and they were pretty fixed in their minds. So he said, a man named Islamov came from Tashkent to investigate some of the rich people and take their land. They held a meeting. They took their land and made it into the kolkhoz. At the meeting, they said, join the kolkhoz. There won't be any taxes, and everyone will live in peace. Before that, taxes were very high. We decided not to punish those who decided to join, and they joined quickly because they were told, you won't pay taxes. So he included himself in the agitation group. He was a joiner and an enforcer of this whole idea that we take the property away from the rich. This is Musa Khan. He was born in the Fergana Valley in 1910. He was the son of a butcher who had owned some land, but he was orphaned when he was young and he inherited nothing. So during collectivization, he became a kolkhoz agitator in his own region near the town of Rishton. He said, the activists for the collective farm were all local people. No one else participated, no Russians or Tatars. There were none in Rishton. The people who joined were those who lived there, and so were the agitators. I would go around door to door gathering people. There were people who wouldn't let you in and who would say, what are you doing here? There were people who opposed collectivization, and there were those who swore their allegiance to it. And he considered himself one of the latter. For him, the collective farm was a good thing, and he succeeded there. So here's a little bit about collectivization in Uzbekistan, just to give you a sense of how quickly this happened. So in 1928, there was an idea of a kolkhoz in Uzbekistan. It was definitely not a normal thing whatsoever, and a kolkhoz would be formed by an extremely enthusiastic rural communist, perhaps, with maybe 10 households. But by 1932, the number of kolkhozes had increased way amazingly, fantastically, and the average number of households in a kolkhoz had also expanded massively, and the percentage of households collectivized had gone up to almost 70%. So you get a sense of just how fast this was. Of course, a lot of those kolkhozes also fell apart. They weren't particularly durable to start with. It's actually hard to trace their numbers because they broke up, formed, reformed, broke up quite frequently. But as resistance was crushed, kolkhozes became durable. And then they started to consolidate into larger ones and so forth. This is a little bit about resistance. So collectivization provoked immediate resistance. In late January 1930, there was a sweep to arrest kulaks in Tashkent province. And rumors spread across all of Uzbekistan out of that particular sweep. And it stimulated anti-collectivization demonstrations in many, many, many regions, but especially in the Fergana Valley. And the Fergana Valley was the area that the government was most interested in collectivizing really fast because that was cotton central. So there were mass actions or demonstrations, really quite a lot of them in 1930. And the participant numbers are always fun to pull out of the archives because you think of these local KGB, OGPU people back then, and they're taking a wild guess at how many people came to this demonstration. And then they write it down and wind up with 13,908. Oh yes, I'm so sure. Exactly that number, right. But one of the things we see here is, so in 1930, the mass demonstrations forced the government to back off a little bit on their pace of collectivization, but then they started again while carrying out a systematic collection of kulaks, arresting people and sending them out of the country. They would send them to Ukraine or to Kazakhstan. And that pretty quickly stopped resistance. And so by 1932, we see that there isn't much resistance to collectivization anymore. So, kulak. And in this book, I use the Uzbek spelling of it because it's a completely foreign word in Uzbek. It's a borrowed term from Russian. In the Russian countryside, of course, peasants belonged to a mir, or at least a lot of them traditionally did. Whether they did all still in, after the revolution is another question, that owned land collectively with land redistribution every 3 years. In that context, the kulak was a peasant who took land out of the collective, formed his own farm, and became wealthier than his neighbors who resented him, and they called him a fist or an oppressor. This was a Bolshevik term to disparage the prosperous peasants. Okay, in Uzbekistan, that's not how Uzbeks referred to richer people. They just called them the rich. And so politically, it was necessary to find terms to make the rich into oppressors. At first, the political language was mushtudzor, which is an Uzbek term which means beating somebody with a fist. And then by the early 30s, with this arrest campaign, the propagandists started to simply use the Russian word kulak, but adapting it to an Uzbek sound, kulak. And in the ways that our informants talked about it, they put it together with a verb to make, kulakkalish. This kulakkaldik, we made them into kulaks, as in that person was just a rich person until we made them into a kulak. What did us making them into a kulak mean? It meant we dispossessed them. We made sure they got turned over to the justice organs and so forth. And this remained then in common speech as a thing that was done. There was an episode in our history of making kulaks. What was the fate of those kulaks? So, well, actually, we have a little bit on who were the kulaks. There is a high estimate of maybe 40,000 male heads of household, and that's out of about 700,000 rural households. So in our interview set, interestingly, 13 of our 125 respondents came from families where either their parents, their grandparents, or they themselves had been made kulak. So what were their fates? They were sent off to other places. Generally, they were exiled with their families. So it's an interestingly different kind of sounding story than we get with dekulakization in some of the other parts of the Soviet Union. It's exile with family, and very specifically, there's all of this discourse about we're going to send Uzbek peasants to Ukraine and to the North Caucasus to start growing cotton there. This is Ernazar. He was born in 1923, so he was just a little kid when all of this happened, maybe 10 years old or something like that. His father belonged to a herding community where actually there wasn't private ownership in land. The clan leaders distributed fields for planting grain, and Ernazar said that his grandfather owned more than 1,000 head of sheep. That was considered a rich person in Uzbekistan. He said, my father didn't have so much. He had 2 camels and he made his living with them. In 1929, we were dispossessed. Some of the people got together and they said that he was one of the rich because of those 2 camels and because my grandfather was rich. So he was made a kulak and all of the livestock was seized. I came home one day and all of our things were taken out of the 2 houses and left out in the open air. The slander was made that we were kulaks and we couldn't do anything about it. Later, a commission showed that some non-kulaks were slandered, named as kulaks. Okay, this story comes up again and again and again. This reflection of 1930s discourses about the kulak. Oh, mistakes were made. My father died after he was imprisoned. Our possessions were taken right down to the quilts. He was left in his village. So his father was taken off, arrested, and somehow died from that. But his the rest of his household was left in the community. And so he was a child. His uncle was still there. He was now a member of the newly formed collective farm. And his uncle recruited him to serve in a new role, which was the tabelchi. The tabelchi was the field recorder, the person who went out with the brigade into the field to write down exactly how much work everyone had done. This was a big role for 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old boys in Uzbekistan after collectivization. And we heard this over and over and over again from our elderly respondents. I went to work on the collective farm when I was very young because I was literate. I was made the tabelchi. And so that was his story. Among our interviewees, there were a bunch of other people whose families had been dispossessed. And there was one who was actually, his whole family was moved to a place of exile within Uzbekistan, a Sazlag state farm. Let's see. So we actually talked to quite a few kulaks, and their stories are quite interesting. I'll just mention a couple of little things. Avez was born in Turkmenistan, and he talked about how in Turkmenistan there was this dekulakization campaign, and his family was afraid that they would be dispossessed. And so his family made some strategic decisions. His father fled over the border to Afghanistan and lived there for the rest of his life. Avez and his mother went with his maternal uncle across the other border to Uzbekistan, settled on a collective farm there where nobody noticed them and they were not kulaks. We got this a fair amount too, this strategizing of using borders, moving across borders. We heard lots and lots of border crossing stories that were about escaping the fate that might have faced you otherwise. Abdul Qadir, on the bottom here, what he and his family were exiled from the Fergana Valley to this place, Bekabad, that's south of Tashkent province, forced to work on developing an entirely previously unirrigated area into an irrigated area to grow cotton. And he was a really interesting respondent because he talked with anger about being dekulakized, and at the same time with deep pride about what they had built at this place of exile. This is Faizullah. And here's one of the stories that we might not actually have expected to hear so much. Stalin set quotas for dispossessing wealthier Dekhans, that is peasants in Uzbekistan, in order to basically scare everybody in the countryside. It's a threat that hung over many heads. If you knew that you could be rounded up as a kulak, you might sign up for the collective farm faster in order to make sure that you didn't get arrested as a kulak. Of course, there was no guarantee. You might get arrested as a kulak anyway. So this is Faizullah, and he talked about his role, which was capturing kulaks who tried to get away. He was born in 1909 in Kashgadarya, and he was the son of a Merdikar. So he came from that class of people who said, I want collectivization and I want to dispossess the rich. By the time collectivization began, he was a student. He had gotten this semi-professional degree at the Hydrology Institute, and he was a Communist Party member. He said, during collectivization, I went to take land from one of the rich and give it to the kolkhoz. And he said, of the anti-kulak campaigns, I was a party representative sent from Samarkand. I went to villages where we found them out. We would hold the kulaks, search their property, and turn them over to the appropriate organization, and then try to make them answerable through imprisonment. And there were instances of seizing their livestock. I wrote up accusations. There were occasions when we made mistakes and wrote up middle dekhans rather than only the rich. We would arrive in the evening, and if there were kulaks who had fled, we would hunt them down. Some of them were exiled with their families. In other cases, they were sent, but their families stayed. So one of the most fascinating things to me about him and the way he told his story was, I might have expected that after the Soviet Union was over and the collective farm is no longer a thing and he's a retired guy and everybody else is talking about the injustices to the kulaks in Uzbekistan's version of anti-colonial history, that he might have changed his story. But no, he proudly embraced the fact that he was anti-kulak back then, and here 100 years later almost, he still was. Insights from interviews on those topics, there was actually a lot of rural support for collectivization. People who had worked in the gates of the rich tended to join the collective farms first, thinking it would improve their lives. They also mentioned a lot about the fact that the organizers were Uzbeks like us. And so there was this sense that it was our project, not somebody else's project. There were districts where we interviewed where people actually said the opposite. No, the people who came here were Russians, and we thought they were stealing from us. So that whether they identified with the organizers or not seemed to have been a rather important thing in whether they thought that the collective farm would be a good thing. And of course, the threat and the reality of arresting people as kulaks meant that there was widespread fear and not much resistance after 1931. So after that, it's really the story of how we organized our collective farm, not how we fought against this. There's a ton of great art from this period, and this one is a very fun one. To establish collective agriculture, we need to break the class enemy and the oppressor. I love this one because I write a chapter about where I really feature tractors, and the tractor is really featured here. And interestingly, you can chase down a kulak with a tractor. I had not thought of that before I got to this poster. All right, at this point, I can go one of two directions. In the interest of not putting you all to sleep, you get to decide, do you want to hear about tractors or do you want to hear about orphans? Either one is an interesting topic.
Orphans.
Orphans.
It's always about the children. Tractors. Come on, it's always about the children. Okay, I think we should have a show of hands.
Okay, orphans. Got a few on orphans. All right, got 4 on orphans. Tractors. Oh crap, we got like 6. Okay, so we'll do.
Sorry.
Wait, no, all right, it's fine, it's fine. Let's see how much time we've got here so that don't drive everybody mad. Okay, so what I'll do is mostly tractors and a little bit of orphans. Okay, so one of the fascinating things to me was of course people tell their stories about when they were young. Well, they were young. When you're young, life can look pretty great, even if there are crazy things going on and the government is turning everybody's life upside down and all of that. But one of the really positive narratives that kept coming out was when we would ask, so do you remember tractors? Do you remember when you saw the first tractor? Eyes would light up and people would start talking about their favorite tractor. They would, there were some other things that they had positive memories about, such as surprisingly some irrigation projects. You wouldn't think that would be fun, but yeah, they were young. They often said, I was young. So they remembered some of these old guys. Of course, they were collective farmers. They lived on collective farms their whole lives. They engaged with farm machinery their whole lives. They remembered tractors by make and by capabilities. They would talk about wheel size. They would talk about gears. They would talk about all kinds of. My vocabulary on tractors in Uzbek really expanded because of this. So they were really interested in tractors as signs of modernization. So our interviewers would ask the interviewees, didn't people reject tractors? Didn't they call them shaitan araba? Shaitan araba is this stereotypical phrase from every 1920s, 1930s film that's made about Central Asia. It's the Satan's cart. Okay, so and the interviewees usually insisted that as soon as people in their community saw how well a tractor worked, they wanted them. So Turbi Boy, I'm not showing you his picture, I'm just showing you some cool tractors, was a young child when he first saw a tractor, and he remembered that moment. His father became a driver, and so did he. So it seems likely that they probably frequently talked about every detail of tractors. He said, when he was a child, we went with my father to see that tractor, the Fordson. I have a Fordson up on top there. The Fordson, at the time, the Soviet state did not know how to make tractors, so they were given them by other countries. They weren't given, they were sold, but whatever. They gave the tractors to plow the fields, to put the poor to work, and to form the kolkhoz. Then the Soviet state produced a tractor called the John Deere. I love the pronunciation of this in Uzbek. I heard it over and over again. Jandar means it has a soul. So the John Deere tractor has a soul. With a flywheel on the side. My father said, I've joined the kolkhoz and it needs tractors, so I will go learn to become a driver. And I also became a tractor driver. We heard stories from people who had were really genuinely excited about this. This changed their lives. They talked about how important it was for the collective farm. They talked about how important it was for their career. We can pull out, numbers from archives telling us about the numbers of tractors in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, oddly, got kind of prioritized for tractors in the late 1920s. So the Soviet Union was spending oodles of money importing these American and European made tractors. And a surprising number of them were being sent to Uzbekistan, where interestingly, they were quite great for plowing fields and even for helping create irrigation furrows, but did absolutely nothing for the major amount of work that you had to do in cotton, which was picking. A tractor doesn't help you with cotton picking. But, so there's this particular kind of awe of the tractor in Central Asia. As of 1931, the Soviet Union started producing its own tractors, and we still see massive numbers of tractors being dispatched to Uzbekistan in particular. This is just a fun side issue. They did actually try doing a mechanical harvester. This is called a vacuum harvester. It was one of the kinds of experiments of the 1930s. Didn't work out. It turns out that vacuum harvesting doesn't actually save you any time, because you have to. This is Baraka. He was born in 1916. He spoke of a tractor demonstration that persuaded the kolkhoz members of its wonders and that decreased their interest in keeping horses. He said it was a Chetazet tractor, which came from Kharkiv. The driver was so high up. They demonstrated how to plow, and everyone saw how it turned the soil. People said, the oxen is not the ruler anymore. And then tractors became more numerous. Interviewer, were they afraid of the tractors? Baraka, no, they weren't afraid. People sat and watched the show, how it plowed and how it could pull. Many of the respondents recalled the first Uzbek tractor drivers in their communities, and they remembered them by name. That included their mentions of the first women tractor drivers. So this left me with a strong sense that seeing fellow Uzbeks, in particular, driving tractors was one of the things that made this innovation acceptable. They might have thought of it as more foreign if the only drivers had been Russian. This is a lovely poster from that time by Simeon Malt. No, not Malt. This is Ustamanin, sorry. And it actually was a response to the over-enthusiastic greeting of tractors. The economic planners began to notice that horses and oxen were being butchered or dispatched at far higher rates than they thought was a good idea. And so this is a poster that tries to persuade the members of collective farms that no, you shouldn't get rid of your horses. You should keep your horses. We're not, the tractor's good, the tractor's important, but we can't replace all the horses, so please keep your horses. And this actually goes to a fascinating detail of how collectives were formed in Uzbekistan, which is different than what happened in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, the point of collectivization was for the state to take control of herds. In Uzbekistan, the point of collectivization was to expand cotton. But if everyone's had given their livestock, especially their draft animals, to the collective farm, then the collective farm would be responsible for feeding them. And so we were told over and over again, when the collectivization was organized, we turned over our land, meaning our farmed fields, and one horse or two oxen, and they kept the rest of their livestock as private livestock. So the real tussle in here was actually this interesting thing of, well, who is responsible for paying for the food or feeding the livestock if the livestock are going to be used on the collective farm to plow for the collective farm? You're a private owner, you have to sustain them? Huh, how is that? And so hence the idea here in 1933 to 1934 is that Uzbek collective farmers were seeing the tractors come in and saying, oh, fine, now we don't have to feed our livestock anymore because the kolkhoz is going to provide for all of this with these tractors. Okay, a tiny bit about orphans. There's been a lot written about orphans in the Soviet Union from the 1920s to the 1930s. There were the 40s, there were very many of them. However, we were not actually trying to find orphans when we did these interviews. It came up when they talked about their family life. Out of 120 interviewees, 125, 41 mentioned that they lost their father during childhood. So that's a third of them. So in this chapter, one of the things that I do is I have two different cohorts. I have those who were born before 1917 and those who were born after 1917, and their lives seem to quite diverge. So if you were an orphan who was born in 1905 or 1910, and you were male, you had a pretty particular trajectory in life. And so this is Hayat Bai. He was orphaned at age 10. And he survived after that. He stayed with his grandmother at first, who hired him out. He went to work for the rich as a herder and then later as a felt maker. In the late 1920s, he joined a cooperative farm labor group, and then he joined a kolkhoz. He went to school because the labor cooperative sent him as an adult. And so we heard stories like that from a number of people of his generation. Their trajectory before collectivization was, if you're orphaned as a child, you go out and you become a worker. That's what happens, and you start to work at age 8 or age 10, starting as a herder, and then you move up and become a day laborer on other people's land. So interestingly, almost none of them mentioned their mothers. The word yatim in Arabic specifically refers to someone who had it's an Arabic word. In Uzbek, it is used to refer to someone who has lost their father. You are an orphan if you have lost your father. And that had to do with the kind of social arrangements that social life followed in Uzbekistan, which is for a guy like Hayat Bai, his mother could not have provided for him after his father died. So this is Narzi. She comes from the next generation, the one that's born after 1917. She was born in 1921, and she said of her father, he had no land, he was very poor, he had no conditions for work, so he went to the city and he died there. It must have been about 1930. We went back to the village. My mother worked doing all kinds of service for people, and we were very poor. Then when the kolkhoz formed, my mother was the first to join it. After she started working, I began working under her wings. Teenagers who worked were given a labor book. We were credited with our own work and paid in our own bread. I joined the kolkhoz at age 12. I worked in cotton, planting, picking, turning it over to the state. We Komsomol members studied half a day and worked half a day in the cotton. And in the evenings, we worked all day long. Otherwise, we would not have had enough to fill our stomachs. She was actually proud of herself and of her mother, saying, you could be satisfied with the money that you earned by your own labor. And her story actually parallels those of everyone who, all of the orphans we heard from who were born after 1917 when the collective farm was formed, it formed a school. Mothers joined the collective farm. Children who had lost their father stayed with their mother and often were enrolled in the collective farm, starting to work at a very young age, but usually they also went to school. So this was a very different trajectory than what had happened for the older generation of people who were orphaned. These are interesting, these were tremendously interesting stories to me because they were unexpected. But for the people who talked about being orphaned, their stories are really the ones that illustrate that this was a very serious social revolution. It changed the social order in some really dramatic ways. So this is Bek Murad, born in 1907. He was orphaned at an older age. He was 14 or 15 when he was orphaned. After that, he started to be a day laborer working in the gates of the rich, but he got to go to an end illiteracy school, joined the collective farm, and eventually worked his way up to being collective farm director. So his is a story that happens partly really because of this huge social change. And yeah, so we have this spectrum of these kinds of stories. So taken as a whole, oral histories are individual views, of course. They provide us with emotions. They provide us with very situated versions of life. Because of the way things worked in Uzbekistan, we were interviewing people in their homes. Typically in Uzbekistan, the odd people who come from the city, and this was our younger researchers and me and others, we're outsiders, we're guests. This would be an occasion. And so it wasn't just one-on-one somebody interviewing the elderly member of the household. Instead, they would invite their sons and daughters to come, neighbors would drop by, there would be a little audience for this account, and that provoked some really interesting things because there could be interactions in the room, but you said this, or I heard this, or how can you say that about the kulaks, and so forth. So they were the social stories that older people probably had told to their own families numerous times, and now they were allowing us to record those. Their stories interact with state propaganda at various points, and we also see that their stories conflict with each other. So different elderly people from the same community in Uzbekistan could see exactly the same set of events through absolutely opposite lenses. This was fabulous, or this was terrible. See, there's my little pitch for that. Before I end, I'll just mention this cover because I love it. It's a piece of art by an Uzbek artist. He did this in the 1970s, and it's called The Peasant. The artist's name is Kutluk Basharov. So I will stop that. All right. And I've probably gone on way too long. So Morgan.
Okay, so we thank Marianne, and we're going to turn over to Morgan Liu, resident in Columbus, Ohio. We see our group online, and we'll have a few minutes from Morgan before turning it over.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you, Bruce, for inviting me to this, for Marianne for countenancing her former Uzbek language student, and for Sasha and the Jordan Center, of course, for hosting me. Let me just share very selectively a few points that struck out at me more on a more higher level, some questions raised for me, maybe for our discussion. I would say the field of Soviet-era Central Asian studies has been waiting for Marianne's study, in the sense that some of the broad parameters of the collectivization story in Turkestan have been known, particularly from a Moscow perspective, but really we didn't know what happened on the ground or how people most affected saw those changes. So the stakes here, I think, are more than just filling in the gaps, but rather raising new questions about how Central Asians became Soviet in terms of their ways of seeing the world, about how they saw themselves, how they articulated personal aspirations within the new political order. Um, and so this book considers how a muscular state activity helped to reform citizen subjectivities and that for a rural society that has the reputation to this very day of being traditionalist and religious and relatively unreceptive to outside ideas. And so this stereotype of the conservative Uzbek is dissolved in the study, I would say, into a more nuanced portrait of agency, where people make background dependent choices, that make situation dependent choices, and where old communal sensitivities uh, inform often new outcomes. And so, yes, relinquishing one's land or livestock, or joining the Communist Party, or joining the kolkhoz, or eating potatoes, that's something Marianne did mention today, but did get a lot of pushback as an alien Russian encroachment. Yet Kamp documents the processes by which traditional practices, ideas, and even literal tastes like the potato became revised. Um, so let me feature a few sort of themes that came out that I just want to throw out there for our consideration. One is about materiality and embodied experience. It's one aspect I think Marianne's study brings out very nicely. So materiality, embodied experience as key sites in evaluating the impacts of Soviet rural transformations. So many respondents spent this is quote, spent a surprising amount of time talking about the concrete elements of everyday rural life that were significant to them, like getting paid, starting to farm with tractors, we heard that, food and famine, another topic of the book, famine, experiencing violence, being orphaned, yes. My own work, interviewing Uzbek elders in Kyrgyzstan during the 1990s, concerned changes in urban neighborhoods around and after the Second World War. And I found a parallel preoccupation with tangible changes around them, to material lives, to municipal infrastructure, and to how that affected social relations. The transformation of nameless, muddy, winding alleys into paved, straight streets with names and house numbers, the use of new building materials, the coming of electricity or gas or television. Again, very specific stories, sort of like what Marianne's saying, the coming of the tractor. I remember the tractor driver's name, but likewise, the coming of these infrastructure elements were remembered by the people I spoke with. The absorption of kolkhoz settlements into urban neighborhoods. That was I lived under kolkhoz, and suddenly overnight I'm now a district of the city, and shifts in residents' professions from farmers into school teachers, drivers, cooks, shopkeepers, office workers. So these layer changes I found in neighborhood spaces and changes in livelihoods told stories about how these urbanized Uzbeks became Soviet. So put next to Marianne's book, these accounts suggest that a signature manner by which many Central Asians experienced progressive elaboration of Soviet rule was often by its materiality and modes of sociality produced by that. It is on the sites of everyday sustenance that ideas and practices of Soviet society were integrated into ways of working, ways of relating. Materiality and embodied experience in rural kolkhozes and urban neighborhoods were key sites where the duality of transformation and persistence took place. Let me spend a moment talking about oral histories, and Marianne's one of the last slides she showed just now talked about. So what does this methodology give us? Especially I want to focus on moments when oral histories tell a different story than the written sources might suggest. To me, that's interesting. Marianne didn't have the chance to talk about the famine of 1933 in Uzbekistan. she had collected some really fascinating oral accounts about that, about the adoption of new foods into the Uzbek diet. They're significant because they reveal an aspect of collectivization, of life and death importance. People starve to death, and that were largely absent from official accounts, from journalism of the time, from government statistics, and in sources since then in Uzbek during the Soviet period. Um, the famine is mostly glossed over in Soviet and outside historiography. Maybe one reason being that the famines in Ukraine and Kazakhstan were much better attested, but much better known. But one interesting question I think raised here is not only why written sources were largely silent about something that really impacted some people's lives profoundly in Uzbekistan. And Marianne does offer some thoughts about why the disparity between written and oral sources, but she does not really pursue that in this book. But um, but also there's the basic question of how scholars ought to be pushing the frontiers of methodology to get experiences undocumented in conventional sources. So Kamp caught the collectivization generation near the point of their passing. So of course, we as a field are grateful that she and her collaborators, Russell and Ilyar and others, have done that. But uh, but but of course, oral histories are unable to capture most stories on the world historical canvas. So, I'm going to raise this question quickly here, even though it's beyond the scope of the book, because the famine chapter is a tantalizing reminder that these events can be highly significant to some people, but elude historical capture. So how can, my question, how can oral histories be combined with other approaches to try to get at some of these lacunae, these gaps? And so let me just mention in passing one innovative, if controversial, attempt at the recovery of traces that some of you might be familiar with, which is Ilya Gerasimov's 1918 book, Plebeian Modernity, which attempts to give voice to the urban poor in the early 20th century Russia by mining unconventional sources like police records or literary accounts of public behavior to get at what the plebeians were thinking and doing that otherwise people who left no other discursive traces. So one problem about this approach, in my view, is that Gerasimov might be overriding plebeian voices with his own voice when he reads those texts in an unconventional manner. But oral histories carry less of that risk, I think, though the subjects themselves could override their own experience of the time through retrospective revisions of scent making. That's another issue that Marianne has talked about. I'll say something more about that in a moment. But nonetheless, Kamp's work in this project does recover the experience of traces that otherwise would have been lost to the historical account. So I'm just brainstorming to think about what we could push the envelope on getting at voices that are not documented. So maybe I should skip some stuff here. Yeah, let me just then go to the question of how subjects recounting about something happening in the 1920s, 30s, but then since then have lived full lives through the Soviet period, how their memories can revise the events or the significance of the events to them. So I would call this the temporalities of oral history interviews, that there are multiple time spans and timelines to consider in this methodology. So Marianne Kamp has thought about this for a long time, actually, not just for this book. So they're the narrative timelines of the events being prompted about in the interview about rural lives under collectivization in 1920s, 1930s. Those timelines are multiple because the narrators select from what appear to be significant to them at the moments of interview, what they remember, leaving out what they forget or see as irrelevant or possibly too painful or shameful. And as as Marianne explained, selecting what to recount may not always be a fully conscious process either. I have an example, but I'll skip over that. But there are also the timelines of each narrator's own life course, which illuminate recollections of past events in different ways depending on the social and political circumstances of each stage of one's life. So how one recounts events of the 1920s depends on the context of, say, the 1950s or the 1990s, or when Marianne and her team did the interviews. Whenever one is Marianne has talked about the times where sometimes there are shifting narratives in different moments by the same person about the same events, such as in her masterful 2001 article, The Three Lives of Sadat. So one event, one narrator, but there's attestation of three moments throughout the Soviet period and then post-Soviet period of recounting, but she has different versions of her experience. Let me just skip to, let me just quickly conclude right now. So overall, I would say that this monograph is engagingly and clearly written. It seamlessly flows from historical accounts from secondary sources to the first-person narrative that lend point of view anchors to historical trends. I think she really did that well, and that has really contributed to the texture of what we now know more about of this time and place. Many of the quotations rang true for me in the sense that in the tone, in the manners of speaking. So now I'm really reading the excerpts sort of closely and finding that they echoed what I observed from elderly Uzbek narrative informants in the ways they chose to remember, the senses of conviction sometimes in their versions of events, a confident denial of countervailing narratives when I would challenge, like Marianne just mentioned about what family members can challenge during the audience. I would sometimes challenge things they say, but there's a sense of confident denial about other versions. There's a posture of moral clarity that offers a determined interpretation of the world and resists challenges to its simplicity. So all humans do that to some extent, but there's a certain discursive style that I found familiar among the narrators of this book. And so Marianne's work captures more than just historical facts, personal experiences, otherwise lost to the scholarly record. She captures a certain way of being in the world. And to me, that's very valuable too. So thank you very much. I turned it over to you.
However modest any talk always seems, we're talking to two of the greats in Central Asian studies, but also in Soviet history for this part of the world. So we really have to thank both Marianne and Morgan, there we are, and many of their colleagues on the screen. So let me open it up to questions, and we'll start. Why don't we be very democratic? We'll start with the first person on the screen, and then we'll go to the room. We'll move to Rawson after.
Donna Han.
Hello, good to see everybody. Thank you so much for this, adding us who are far away from you. And I would rather be in person and joining, but thanks for the opportunity and for the lectures. Morgan, Marianne, it's great to see you and then to celebrate the book. And it's been a pleasure to be part of this process, Dr. Kamp. It's been a pleasure to get into the stories deeper in the early parts of the project. I just want to say thank you and then also share a little bit that in terms of the kolkhoz, it's working in the fields was so dearly ingrained in my memories because my mom, who was a kolkhoz farmer, until she retired, she was very active, like always recipient of the big prizes for the most cotton picking competitions and stuff. But when I was ready to college applications, she said, you have 1 year of a chance. If you do not get into the university, I will get you 3 hectares of the land and you will be working on the farm. That was the ultimatum that I got. And so I do appreciate the stories of all the interviewers, how the unique and special was their experiences, and as a growing up the child of the kolkhoz. So we are moving many decades forward from this time frame, but still, you know, being part of the history was kind of, I could relate more to the stories that the interviews were telling, and I'm really grateful for you and the team who brought these stories into light. And thank you for your contribution to the scholarship and, you know, making the history speak.
Thank you, Donna Han. I should say thank you to you too. Donna Han actually worked on this project by doing a bunch of translating for me. And I deeply appreciate that. So, and actually she also gave me a lot of information when I would read through transcripts. I'm like, I have no idea what this farming term is. Guess who my insider who could tell me what that farming term was? That was Donovan Abdulgafurova. So thank you.
Thank you.
Back here.
A couple of quick questions, and one is has to do with the way, you know, how did collectivization affect the family structure of the rural family? I mean, because presumably completely reconfigured the kind of social reproduction that was necessary, and what happens to the role of the
family. Surprisingly, it doesn't change it all that much. And this is my thesis on this, and it's also a thesis about why famine, while it happened in Uzbekistan, was not actually that severe. It was that rural life was disrupted in one major way. People had to put their fields together and they had to go out and work together. It was not disrupted in other ways. People stayed in their same houses with their same families, raised the kids in the same way. And so for families, of course, who suffered the loss of a male head of household, things got fairly disrupted, certainly. And the solutions to that in kolkhoz time were different than they were in previous times. In previous times, a widowed woman would have quickly been married off to another person, right? And whereas in kolkhoz times, a widowed woman would join the kolkhoz and see how life worked out. But family structures don't seem to change all that much. And Uzbekistan in rural communities does not move away from the large family with the large family compound toward nuclear housing. That just doesn't happen in rural communities. So in that sense, there's probably far more continuity in rural life in Uzbekistan than there is in many, many other parts of the Soviet Union, where this whole process was so much more disruptive of, you know, those nuances of what could happen in your life as well. Back there, and then, yes.
Yes, thank you. The armed resistance towards collectivization in Central Asia has been well documented and written by, of course, Conquest and Sheila Fitzpatrick and Pack, etc. So it means that you spoke to the bunch of survivors or KGB snitches or those who were complicit with NKVD guys during the collectivization. I'm curious to which extent that affected your study.
Right.
I'm curious whether people you spoke to, whether they acknowledge that basically their life happened because many thousands of others were killed. I assume that those orphans you are talking about, they probably lost their fathers because they were, members of the resistance, or maybe because they were imprisoned, as they were imprisoned everywhere in the Soviet Union during collectivization. So I'm just curious to which extent people you spoke to, they knew about the story, and to which extent you tried to challenge them and ask, what did happen to their neighbors who disappeared or who were killed? There was famous resistance in Mangashwak, for instance, it's well documented. So thank you very much. So that's my question.
So part of understanding what goes on in Central Asia is catching the temporality, and the major resistance to Soviet coercive reconquest of Central Asia is really the Basmachi War, which is 1917 to 1923, long before there's any collectivization. So there's tremendous violence during that period. And we did talk with people who remembered it and talked about the impact on their families and so forth, and who talked about where their families were positioned in that, because some of them were in the Basmachi side, most of them were not, for the obvious reason that if you were on the Basmachi side and you were defeated, well, you stood a good chance of either being kicked out of the country or being killed or whatever. Yes. And some of our orphans come from that time, but they're not all because of the Basmachi conflict. They're because of all of the things that happen in ordinary life, including epidemics and things like that. So when we get to collectivization, there was resistance. There was not much armed resistance in Uzbekistan. When we look at the descriptions of the kinds of resistance that turns up, it is gangs of rural people coming into town with their hoes, which are, yeah, you could kill somebody with a Central Asian hoe. You absolutely can, but not guns, not that sort of thing. So Mangashwak is actually a very interesting story, precisely because it is a unique story in Central Asia. It's not representative. It gets a lot of documentation, it got a lot of attention, and it was a very serious thing. But we don't find similar kinds of accounts in other places, partly because the armed resistance had already mostly been defeated. This is different in Tajikistan. In Tajikistan, there is a serious armed resistance that goes into the 1930s. So the temporalities in different places are quite different. So because of that, it's actually the violence of the early 1920s that lays the groundwork for making collectivization possible. And then the next round of violence, which was state violence in creating kulaks, right? Declaring that certain people are the enemy of the state. Was the way of defeating resistance, not necessarily armed resistance, but just I don't want to join, right? So by 1933, you kind of knew that if you said I don't want to join, somebody was going to call you a kulak and you would get shipped out. Did people know this? Absolutely. And they talked about it, and we asked them questions about, kulaks in your family or in your community, and responses were all different. There were quite a lot of people who remembered the names of people who were arrested, captured, sent away, died, and they would remember people in their own communities, sometimes with great pity, sometimes with, I was one of the people who helped to out them. And they knew quite sometimes people in the interview situation would say, really, didn't this or that happen to the kulaks? And that would kind of distill some stories about, yes, well, yes, we do remember that so-and-so was unjustly dekulakized. What interested me, though, was that this was post-Soviet, and I do write about this in the book, about this fact that from an official state perspective, by early 2000s, everything Soviet was bad. Collectivization, everything, this was all colonialism, it was all oppression, et cetera, et cetera. And I was quite surprised by elderly people who maintained their sense that no, we, the poor, got the land, and they, the rich, got dispossessed, and that was just. So what fascinated me was the diversity of the ways that elderly people told their stories, clinging to, sometimes really actually reiterating exactly the kinds of language that was used in the 1930s. This, oh, of course, mistakes were made. That came up again and again and again. And it suggested that these were stories that had been told over and over and over in communities. People had talked about these, especially about dekulakization in the 30s when it happened, and then in the 1960s, this is kind of post-Khrushchev thaw and the opening up of certain archival things, and there's a whole lot of new discourse about it. And by that time, the people we were talking to were, they would have been in their 40s, 50s, they were adults. They clearly had had these conversations in their own communities about who was guilty and who had benefited and things like that. And we're picking up bits of that in, much, much, much later. So that's about what I can say on that. Did I address your question?
Sort of, because at the time when you were in Uzbekistan, there were over 20,000 political prisoners.
Yes.
Kirimov constructed one of the worst regimes in the Soviet. There was much worse was in Turkmenistan, but basically these two countries, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, they were extremely repressive, and they were also extremely repressive in terms of their own history.
Yes.
So I'm just curious to which extent these affected your conclusions. I'm looking forward to reading your book, of course.
Yeah. So my conclusions about it are all quite complex. At the time, actually, there was an Uzbek scholar, Rustanbek Shamsuddinov, who was writing about dekulakization and collecting oral histories with descendants of families who had been exiled to Ukraine and North Caucasus, and publishing that in Uzbekistan. There was a big volume, that triple archival volume that came out in 2006 called Tragedia Srednyoasiatskого Kishaka. So there was actually scholarship going on this, and it was out there in the public and so forth. At the same time that all of those crappy things were going on at the presidential level. One of what was fascinating to me was, and this has always fascinated me in my work in Uzbekistan, because Uzbekistan, yes, always has these political, repressive orders and this and that. And then I walk in there and I say, well, I'd like to ask questions about veiling. Let me tell you, in the early 1990s, the general response I got was, why would you want to do that? But I have a grandma who will talk to you, sure. It was perceived as a completely neutral and completely uninteresting question, right? When we went and did these oral histories of collectivization, the general response was, why would you want to do that? But it was perceived at the time as, oh, whatever, let the old folks speak, right? So if I had gone there and said, tell me what you think of President Karimov, yeah, I wouldn't have gotten in the door. People have typically been willing to talk about topics that they feel are not dangerous topics. And at the time, they didn't think collectivization was a dangerous topic. We did have people say certain views about Karimov, and I made sure, those are in the transcripts. I will never write anything about that. No, they didn't tell me that in order to get their names published on some blacklist. So doing research in Uzbekistan is always a nuanced kind of thing. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about mobility in terms of moving to cities or urbanization.
Mhm.
Just because it's such a major feature of all the Russian, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian sort of rural history of this period. And I'm curious how much of that is going on in Uzbekistan at the time. Are the people you're interviewing people who stayed behind while other members of their generation went off and got a factory job? Are they people who stayed behind as their children went off and moved to the cities? Sort of where do they sit within that process? And how does that, are they sort of self-selecting into the collective farm life in some sense by not pursuing some of these options, or are these just not opportunities they have? These are
Right,
opportunities
right.
that come in different ways.
Mhm.
And this, I think, raises more broadly a question that I'm just curious to hear what you think about sort of uncertainty in the road not taken. It strikes me, and we had this in Morgan's response to you, that people come up very strongly on collectivization happened. I knew what I was going to do. Here was my plan. I'm curious if you ran into other places where people remembered doubt, remembered ideas of, potential alternative choices they could have made, or whether that was sort of fully excised from the narratives they were telling about themselves.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the people that we talked with, we were going to rural communities to find respondents. So by definition, we were finding people who had stayed in those rural communities. That doesn't mean that everyone did. We had some interviews actually in more urban environments in Fergana Valley and in Tashkent City, with people who had grown up somewhere on a kolkhoz and then moved to the city. Urbanization was definitely a thing at the time. And one could look at that kind of as a statistical thing. The challenge is, of course, in Central Asia, in the 1930s, there was this big return to colonialism, we could call it, where an awful lot of Russians were moving to Central Asia and often moving to the cities. And so the cities become even more Russian than they already were. And urbanization doesn't seem to happen for Uzbeks at a high clip in that time period. The strictures put on peasant movement tended to keep people in their own communities. And yet we talked with a lot of people who, as I mentioned, the intermediaries who were choosing respondents who could remember often chose teachers. And those were often people who had gone off to some teacher institution for at least a little while. They had lived in a city and then they returned and they became a teacher in the village. And so it wasn't the case that they had no other opportunity, but probably, yes, not so many choices. We talked with some people though who, they're especially they went off to World War II, they fought, they came back, and now they had a different set of possibilities in their hands. And we talked with some of our respondents who said, after that, I left the collective farm and I got a job in the city and so forth. So that seems to be more a post-World War II thing in Uzbekistan, as far as we can tell. Roads not taken, though, it's not a question that we kind of opened up, and not really something that I've thought about while reading. You read a heck of a lot of transcripts and then see, what are the salient details that come out? And that wasn't really a question in my mind, but I think for a lot of them, it wasn't a question. I mean, when they talked about what were the alternatives, they were talking about people from their own families who crossed the border to Kazakhstan, across the border to Tajikistan, or kind of reinvented their story so that they were no longer a mullah, they were something else. So we heard a lot of narratives that were about strategies that you pursue to survive in this very, very harsh environment of new political circumstances. And those were really where people thought of alternatives, right? And they would say, we had people who said in interviews, yeah, we had this organization meeting and the agitator said, come join the kolkhoz. And if you don't want to do that, the border to Afghanistan is right over there. So that was kind of the extent of how people were thinking about their alternatives at the moment. Yeah.
I don't want to press our time too much, but I think this is a quite interesting question, right? Because even the earlier question about, the political context then and now asks about voices not there or voices adjacent, right? So I want to think about space here a little bit. We have one fellow whose father expressly went to cross the border to Afghanistan and didn't come back, right? Fine. I appreciate that a lot of doors closed and information flow, but at least until World War II, there was still a fair bit of mobility, as I understand it. And so I guess I'm just wondering how much you had a consciousness of, or the either from these first person voices, right? On whom I don't think we have to rely exclusively, because again, there's a lot of people who weren't there, right? Who had already died, but also what first person voices do is they complicate the kinds of the library and archival sources that we have, right? So you got in this field of rich complications. And I wonder, for those of us who are not specialists on Central Asia, right? Can you situate how an Uzbek story might feel different from a Tajik experience, a Kazakh experience, an Afghan experience nearby? Only because I don't need you to be more than this book, and I'm not trying to put you in, but like in the Caucasus, right? The story of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia are very different collectivizations, and they're all adjacent to each other, right? Azerbaijan was really the poorest, and that was really kind of the most flattened, but also slightly less resistance in a demographic sense. Georgia was, even though things got collectivized, no one ever forgot whose land was whose. They all referred to it on a day-to-day basis, whose land they were working. In Armenia, of course, they survived the genocide, so there was much more of a kind of a forward thinking, well, this isn't exactly how we thought it was going to go, but at least we're going to, there was a completely different. So is there a story here in Uzbekistan, for those of us who don't know what you and Morgan know already, and Adrian Edgar's, that a lot of people are on the screen here, that would feel different if we were doing this kind of oral history work X 100 kilometers to the east, west, north, south?
Yes, totally. I do a little bit of that comparison in this book, but more in a article with Nikola Pianciola about Kazakhstan. It's very, very different. And one of the reasons I emphasize material conditions and who owns what and how people farmed in Uzbekistan is that it was so different from Kyrgyzstan, where there were a lot of Russian colonizers who had taken most of the arable land. And so Kyrgyz herders were herders, and actually collectivization came to Kyrgyz rather late. It got kicked off. So in Kazakhstan, things are absolutely disastrous, right? There's this swift move to, in theory, it's collectivized, but really it's just to seize the livestock herds from Kazakh herders, which is why people died in hideously enormous numbers. And that was 1930. That starts in 1930. And by 1932, the scale of famine there is mind-blowingly awful. And for whatever reason, Kyrgyzstan did not even really start that process, except in a very nominal kind of way, until a little bit later. So we start seeing Kyrgyz herders being seriously collectivized by 35 or 36, but it seems like maybe there are some lessons learned from Kazakhstan, that you don't just stick people together and give them no resources and hope that their animals survive. And Kyrgyzstan's Soviet period history really seriously is not very deeply researched, one might say. In Tajikistan, there are areas where it looks exactly like what's going on in Uzbekistan, and that tends to be the north. That's Khojaand. The rest of Tajikistan, Patrick Reed and a few other people have written about this. So is Botaka's Kasimbekova. It's a thought about how to develop riverine areas and more of the lower arable land, partly by forcing people who were doing herding, grazing, and living up in the mountains to move down. And so there's a lot of forced movement that goes with collectivization in Tajikistan, which is not the case in Uzbekistan. In Uzbekistan, people are where they were. That's where they're being collectivized. And that is the critical material condition that means that, so you're in Uzbekistan, you still have your house garden, you still have your house. And when famine hits in 1933, Uzbeks don't die in massive numbers because they still have other sources of food. And they're in their homes, and their lives are not a story of forced migration or this or that. And whereas the stories in Tajikistan, pretty violently disruptive of life, and in Kazakhstan, we know, quite hideous. So yeah, the trajectories are different in different places. And it's not because collectivization was a good idea or a bad idea. It was a bad idea. But in Uzbekistan, simply the conditions where it was carried out were more survivable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Noting the time, I just want to pause again just to thank not only Marianne, but our discussant on the screen beaming in from Columbus, Ohio. Everyone up on the Zoom screen, thanks.
Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it.